The protagonist let out a big yawn just as the morning sun started to shine through the window. As soon as she opened her eyes, she wondered when she had fallen asleep. The girl burst into tears out of fear. The moment a status window suddenly appeared right in front of her, the protagonist was shocked to realize that she couldn't say normal words. The status window said that the girl was a supporting character, and that her father would kill her on her 9th birthday, just a minute before the protagonist had been playing on her phone. And because of that bad launch at the beginning of the game, she ended up being a low-rank character in this recap manhwa. She was right in the middle of leveling up the cube to level 9 and even spent all her money on it. The protagonist couldn't believe she just jumped from one world to another. The girl looked back at the status window and started examining it closely. The most terrifying part was that she had to die at the hands of her own father on her 9th birthday. Even though she was just a nameless character, this was too much. The protagonist began to cry, and immediately, an unknown woman approached her to comfort her. The maid picked the girl up in her arms and told her that Lady Eris would come to see her soon. At that moment, the girl felt the warmth and tenderness that the maid conveyed to her. Now she truly understood that she was destined to die at 9 years old. The protagonist started mentally pleading for someone to come and save her. She wanted with all her might to wake up and find out that it had all been just a dream. If she was already in that situation, at least she could try to live well in her second life. Our protagonist realized she was the only daughter of a noble and rich family. She was glad not to belong to one of those noble families that had fallen from grace. Her parents didn't care about her, because nothing about her interested them. However, the protagonist thought it would be much easier for her to escape when the time came. The third most important thing was that she was in a world inside a game. Our protagonist entered a game called Reincarnation, decided by a die. It was a mobile game. Based on the novel Heroes of Helios, you had to roll the die to choose one of the characters from the novel, and then make decisions based on the result. The rank of the heroes depended on their importance in the original story. Starting from a simple first-level extra, there are 5 ranks up to the 5th-level protagonist, who is the main character. But the girl had the first rank. One thing is the rank, but she didn't even know or understand who she was. It had been a week since she appeared in the game, and the name still hadn't been shown. Seeing her fate, it was understandable that her father wouldn't care, but not even her mother appeared. She only showed up once, but the protagonist decided not to jump to conclusions. She took a deep breath and exhaled to calm herself and organize her thoughts. Our protagonist was waiting for the name to appear so she could make a plan and face that cruel destiny. The status window disappeared and the girl started yawning from fatigue. It was probably because she was a child, and that's why she was sleepy. The protagonist closed her eyes and decided to think about everything else as soon as she woke up. The girl felt very happy as soon as the kind maids fed her. Today everyone seemed busy, so the protagonist began to wonder if something was happening. The maids started to renew the young lady's room, and the protagonist didn't understand why they were doing that. The maid asked Lady Eris if she wanted her to move the cup with the stones to another place. She asked the maid to put it in the display case, because the young lady liked it. The maid immediately responded that it made no sense because a child so small wouldn't notice something like that at her age. Lady Eris said that her young lady was not only smart, but truly amazing. The woman commented that the girl always looked around with bright eyes as if she understood everything. The protagonist realized that she should try harder to pass as a baby. She noticed that the information window had changed to the supporting character version and now showed the gender and age. The girl didn't like that they still hadn't shown her the window with her skills. If she ended up stuck in this body for being a level 1 character, it wasn't clear what would happen to the cube. After all, the protagonist had spent all her money on that object. She wondered if during the last upgrade a strange window hadn't appeared. Now, the protagonist couldn't believe that upgrading the cube had led her to this traveling between worlds because of a level 9 cube. It was clearly madness. If leveling up had made her change worlds, then they should have given her a better destiny. The girl began to calm down because she couldn't get mad about something that had already happened. She decided to think positively because willpower defines destiny. It was probably hard to check the cube's buff since she was still a baby. Lady Eris wondered if they would finish the preparations before the Lord returned. The letter arrived quite late, but they still had to finish everything before his arrival. The maid began to complain a little, and then Lady Eris suggested she scrub the floor. Things were going wrong again, so they had to keep working anyway. Now the girl understood that she hadn't seen the owner of the mansion because he wasn't even here. With all the information, she had nobody cared about the girl so she could live quietly and escape without anyone noticing her. Madame Eris said that if she neglected the young lady even a little, the Lord would scold her with a smile. She asked Yurin not to be so scared, and the maid asked Madame not to joke about such serious things. The protagonist realized that even if she could change her destiny, she still had no real guarantees. The girl froze in fear as a terrifying thought crossed her mind. What if her crazy father killed her before she turned 9? The protagonist decided that if she ever met the game creator, she would take revenge on them mercilessly. The dark-haired maid smiled when she saw that the young lady was already awake. Agnes noticed that today the girl was in a much better mood than usual. The protagonist was happy because today valuable things stood out more for the little girl. Money was something so new that it took her breath away. The maid named Selena apologized for not having knocked on the door and warned that she was coming with a message from the head maid. Everyone in the room froze when the maid told them that the Lord had returned to the mansion. The protagonist didn't understand at all why he had come back so quickly if only 2 days had passed. She still wasn't mentally prepared to see her father, who would mercilessly kill her in the future. Madame, Eris ordered the maids to finish quickly while she went to receive the Lord. The girl started to fear that the man would come straight towards her because of how quickly he arrived. It was clear he had something urgent to do. The protagonist knew that at this moment the best thing was to stop thinking and fall asleep immediately. The girl's eyes opened wide as soon as the door burst open and a man with bright red hair entered. Now our protagonist finally knew what her father looked like. Heroes of Helios was a story where the protagonist saves the world from an evil demon king. The demon king controls the minds of monsters and sends them to the human world so people form a squad to confront them. All noble families must participate, and this year our protagonist's family is responsible for the mission. Upon returning from the expedition, the first thing he did was go straight to his little daughter. The protagonist didn't understand anything, because that man was supposed to be indifferent to his own daughter. She wasn't at all prepared to meet her real father like this. The man stopped right in front of the crib and looked closely at his daughter. He was actually much more handsome than the protagonist had imagined, but the man's presence was so strong that he seemed capable of killing a lion with his bare hands. The girl didn't understand why he was looking at her that way. The gaze of that man with long red hair began to scare the protagonist. She started to feel fear at the thought that this man could kill her at that very moment. Then she remembered that in these cases, there was only one solution that never failed. The protagonist knew the ultimate trick of all babies perfectly. She turned her head to one side and pretended to fall asleep right in front of her father. The girl truly hoped that seeing her asleep, the man would leave soon. The nanny told the Lord that the little girl was very tired, so he could take off his armor for now. The man coldly asked if at that age, children could really maintain eye contact with others. Madame Eris answered that at that age, they were just beginning to discover the world, so it was normal for them to behave like that. The woman assumed that the child acted like that because they shared the same blood. The girl thought that if that man got so angry next time, it would be better not to look at him. Suddenly, the protagonist felt how strong male hands carefully lifted her. She understood that if she opened her eyes, she would surely be lost. So she had to keep pretending to be asleep. Suddenly, the girl burped right in the man's face and started reproaching herself for not having held it in for 5 more minutes. The owner of the mansion asked the nanny if babies really burp even when they sleep. Madame Eris replied that if you give them a pat on the back while they sleep, they are most likely to burp. The man remained thoughtful, and the girl began to mentally thank her savior. Then he laid the girl down on the bed and warned the nanny that he was going to take off his armor. The other maids thought that Madame Eris was incredible because she always managed to stay calm. Agnes was happy that the young lady was safe and hadn't been harmed. Our protagonist was sure that Agnes was also scared and worried about her. The father of the protagonist had golden eyes, and in the novel, that was something very rare. By the way the nanny spoke to her father, the girl understood that her status was no less than that of a marquise. However, she still didn't understand if there was a noble family with red hair and golden eyes of that rank in the novel. The protagonist couldn't recall that family so surely. It wasn't that important in the original story. If that family were relevant, the girl wouldn't be just a first-level background character. Since her father had returned, she could find out her name and where she was. The next day, the father left the mansion again, and most likely he went to the capital to give his report on the repression. In theory, he should return after delivering the report, but for some reason, the man went straight back to the mansion. The protagonist concluded that her father was someone totally unpredictable. Agnes asked what the young lady was thinking and suggested that she better smile. The girl didn't understand how that girl could be such an adorable angel. Today, the protagonist was in a good mood. She smiled widely at the maid. The maid said that the young lady's smile was precious and admitted that the girl resembled her mother a lot. Madame Eris ordered the maid to be quiet and added that it was good that the Lord wasn't in the mansion at that moment. The protagonist thought that her father didn't care about her because of her mother. She doubted that her mother had died and that now her father blamed his daughter for her death. But from what Madame Eris said, it was clear that something happened between her father and her mother. Maybe if the protagonist managed to figure it out, she could survive. The girl caught the attention of her favorite maid and smiled at her eagerly. Jurin commented that this year the repression had lasted longer than usual. Normally it took 1 or 2 months, but this time it lasted a full 3 months. Now the protagonist understood that her father had also been there during her birth. Remembering how the man treated her the first time he saw her, our protagonist thought he was a heartless man. The best thing for the girl was to never cross paths with him. At least it didn't seem that the man was purposefully denying her a name. As soon as the protagonist knew her name, she would understand which family she belonged to and what her role in it was. A small girl decided that she was going to change her life no matter the cost. She fell asleep, and in her dreams, she saw an object that appeared right in front of her eyes. It was a level 9 cube, but the system notified her that she still hadn't met the requirements to activate it. Moreover, the system informed her that one of the game events had already begun, but the protagonist still had to meet the conditions for activation. The girl opened her eyes as soon as she heard someone calling her, looked at her little hands, and wondered if all of that had just been a dream. Agnes worried asked the young lady if she was okay, because she had twisted around as if she was in pain. The protagonist was surprised that her maid was scared, so she silently apologized. The maid thought that the girl had probably had a nightmare, but now felt relieved. Madame Herrier told Agnes that they should check the room again before lunch. The protagonist was in shock as soon as the nanny told her that the Lord would be back at night. The little girl was upset because she had been preparing, and the man still hadn't appeared. One of the maids entered the room and informed the lady that the Lord was coming. Our protagonist was surprised when the owner of the house reappeared without warning. The man approached the crib and the girl looked at him attentively. On the collar of his shirt, the protagonist noticed a small golden brooch in the shape of a dragon. She immediately looked away, and the nanny explained to the man that small children are very unpredictable. The Lord said that since the girl had been born, it was time to give her a name. The protagonist was happy because after 3 months they were finally going to give her a name, and truly hoped it would be a nice one. Suddenly, the man said that the name Cobra could suit the girl. For a daughter of a family whose job is to take lives, that name fits perfectly for our protagonist. Of course, she found it funny because she didn't understand how they could call their daughter that for that reason. The man stared deeply into her eyes, and in them the status window reflected that the choosing event had begun. The protagonist was in shock, not understanding what was happening. She also didn't understand why suddenly everyone around her fell silent. The girl felt that she couldn't even move. Suddenly, the system announced that the next choice would depend on the player's actions and the girl could move. Our protagonist thought that her choice depended on what she herself would do. The man's gaze clearly indicated that if he didn't like something, he could show it to her immediately. The protagonist began to wave her arms and make protest noises. Then the man extended his hand, and the girl left an artificial flower on her. The man looked closely at her hand, where Alice's flower was. He never thought he'd see an Alice flower at that time of year, so he squeezed it in his fist. The owner of the house, with a calm voice, announced that they would change the old name. The protagonist's eyes sparkled when the man called her Alice Draven. The nanny and the personal maid immediately smiled and congratulated the young lady. For her new name, our protagonist couldn't believe she had actually beaten her stubborn father. The status window informed that the conditions were met and now the character's rank would change. The character information window updated and potential skills also unlocked. The protagonist noticed that a section about the crazy father and being torn apart was added. That detail was so explicit that the girl felt like crying in this recap manhwa. Suddenly, she remembered that she had already heard the surname Draven somewhere. Thinking of her father's brooch, the girl wondered if the Dravens were those dragon heirs. That family is known in the Empire for having inherited dragon blood and having amazing abilities. The protagonist always knew that family was not common at all. If they brought her here by force, then the girl had surely earned all of this. Our protagonist thought about what else she could have read about that family. In the book, the Dravens have many secrets, and several are related to the side effects of the powerful dragon blood. If someone from another family carries a child of the Dravens in their womb, they will suffer throughout the pregnancy and will end up dying. There were cases where family members couldn't handle their own power and lost control. The girl assumed that her mother probably died giving birth to her, and that her father could kill her because of that. The protagonist also felt fear as soon as she noticed the man's cold gaze watching her. Then he announced that now that the child of the Dravens had a name, they should have a small celebration. The nanny and the personal maid immediately smiled and said that the lord of the house was absolutely right. The man remembered that he couldn't even celebrate the birth of his daughter because he was at war. He ordered a grand banquet to be prepared in honor of the birth of the first daughter of the Draven family. The lord asked how long it would take, and they answered that it depended on the number of guests. The red-haired man immediately understood that it would take about a month. The nanny and the girl's personal maid nodded and said they would do as the Lord ordered. The father then looked at his daughter, whose eyes were watching him in surprise. The man told the employees that he would personally inform the head maid about everything. The nanny immediately nodded, showing that she agreed with his lordship. The protagonist was surprised because the man didn't even say goodbye to her. She immediately stuck her tongue out at him and frowned at her father. But only later did Alice realize that the man was still holding the flower-shaped brooch. That clearly surprised the protagonist, but new ideas and assumptions began to arise in her head. She closed her eyes and thought that maybe the man was just very shy. A whole week passed since the day they named the girl, and the father began to come often without warning. The protagonist didn't understand at all why he came to keep staring at her sleeping face. Suddenly, The girl heard the man's voice asking her what her name was. Alice couldn't believe he had understood that. Someone else lived in his daughter's body. Agnes immediately told his lord her name, and Alice understood that question wasn't for her. The man had heard that in his absence, Madame Eris was taking care of Alice. The maid felt uneasy and asked his lord why he wanted to know that. He asked if they had noticed any strange behavior in the young lady. Agnes began to get nervous and murmur something, but the lord coldly asked her to speak clearly. The girl wasn't sure what his lordship meant by strange behavior, so he had to clarify. The protagonist in her mind ordered her personal maid to respond firmly, but suddenly the man announced that the girl was not fit to be the maid of the Draven family and ordered the maid Agnes to leave the mansion before the next day. The system notified that a new event had been activated, but the protagonist wasn't prepared because she couldn't allow Agnes to be thrown out. The small girl's body didn't move, but she still had to protect Agnes. The protagonist looked at the rattle, and the system informed her that her actions would decide the next possible option. She grabbed the rattle and threw it between the two people. The lord and Agnes looked at the small girl in surprise. The man stared at his daughter, but that wasn't going to scare her. She was already used to that cold gaze, so she didn't feel any fear. Then the protagonist looked at Agnes, and her face instantly lit up with joy. She stretched out her arms, and in her mind asked Agnes to take her hands. Suddenly, the protagonist felt she was going to fall, because her legs were still too weak. The maid immediately held her and asked the lady to be careful, because it was dangerous. The girl looked at her father and thought, who does he think he is to try to dismiss his maid? To the protagonist, Agnes was worth much more than what that man could ever be worth. The lord immediately realized that his daughter Alice liked the girl. Agnes smiled immediately and said that the lord was right. But suddenly he ordered the maid to put his daughter back in the bed and step aside. Immediately, the man added that he was asking the maid to leave so he could be alone for a moment with Alice. The protagonist felt relieved, thinking that in the end, they weren't going to dismiss her maid. But still Alicia decided that she would repay her father's debt as soon as she grew up. Our protagonist was very surprised when the man suddenly extended his fist, immediately grimacing, thinking he was going to hit her. Right there. But suddenly the lord pinned a flower-shaped brooch to the clothes of his little daughter. The father said he already had a gift prepared for the celebration, but it wouldn't be right not to give her anything. He paused and said it was a special gift for a little girl. He thought it would be bad if rumors started circulating that the only daughter of the Draven family hadn't received a single gift from her parents. The protagonist was surprised that the man cared about such nonsense, although someone so concerned about his family's reputation clearly wouldn't have called his daughter Alice. The girl looked at him with disdain, wondering silently how he dared to lie to her so shamelessly. The man sighed deeply and said he didn't even know why he was explaining all of that to a baby. The protagonist was glad that now he was acting convincingly. She looked at the girl with enthusiasm and asked if that gift had really been given to her by the Lord. It turned out that if the man gave her something like that, he really cared. But in reality, our protagonist had no idea what that was for. Still, the little girl was happy that her personal maid Agnes was back in a good mood. It made sense because in the end, the young lady hadn't lost her job. Earlier, the man had said that since Alice liked the maid, she would continue taking care of the girl. He trusted her. And from now on, Agnes had to take care of the princess even more diligently. Anyway, that brooch had probably been made by another town. For the first time in her life, the maid saw a brooch with such a unique cut. The maid commented that that brooch really looked good on the young lady. Time flew by, and before we knew it, the day of Alice's birthday arrived. Over time, the protagonist learned to turn around confidently. Now she could say short phrases, although a bit clumsily, but others managed to understand her. The maids approached the young lady's crib, and one suggested starting to prepare her since the girl had woken up. Agnes immediately smiled and informed the other maids that it was time. She asked Urine to put in a bath bomb because the little lady was coming. Another maid rushed in and warned that they needed urgent help in the kitchen. Selena replied that they also had a lot of work here but proposed to Urine to go help. The protagonist opened her eyes and was surprised to have fallen asleep, but now she felt rested. Madame Eris told the young lady that she was just about to wake her up, but that she had already gotten up on her own. Suddenly, our protagonist noticed how tired and exhausted her nanny was. The young woman informed her lord that she was going to prepare for the celebration. She asked him not to hug the little lady too tightly because she was very small and fragile. The man told her not to worry, that he could perfectly control his strength. The protagonist didn't understand why her father was hugging her or where everyone had gone. Alicia truly hoped the man wouldn't hug her like that during her first public appearance. She started praying to all the gods of this world that wouldn't happen. Suddenly, the girl remembered the conversation between the nanny and Agnes from the night before. Madame Eris remembered that the young lady would make her appearance alongside Her Excellency. Now, Alice understood that the nanny's words meant that it would be her father who would carry her in his arms. She couldn't do anything about what was already decided, so she just hoped everything would go well. Lately, they had gotten closer, so theoretically the man shouldn't harm her. But her father was holding her poorly, and the protagonist felt super uncomfortable. If you're going to carry a child, you need to support their neck in your arm and hold them properly. The man became alert. When his little daughter began to cry loudly and move her arms, he asked Alice what was wrong and if she was really hungry. The Lord remembered that according to Madame Eris, she had eaten recently, but the protagonist wasn't hungry. She just wanted the man to hold her neck properly. Alice was shocked when the man asked her if it was all because of the dirty diaper. She began to cry even louder because she didn't understand why the conversation had taken that turn. But 5 minutes later, the dirty one started to cry even louder because he didn't understand why the conversation had taken that turn. But 5 minutes later, the protagonist stopped crying and simply accepted her fate. The man didn't understand why she suddenly calmed down and thought it was just whims. Then, in a more serious tone, the man asked Alice if she really felt bad. The protagonist truly didn't understand what nonsense that man was saying. The man suddenly stood up because Alice was much less active than usual. The little one decided to give up and told her dad that he was holding her very uncomfortably. Suddenly, the door opened, and the nanny informed the Lord that the banquet was going to start soon, so he shouldn't leave. He told Madame Eris that he had arrived just in time, because apparently Alice wasn't feeling well. The Lord asked the young lady to see if Alice's face showed any pain. The nanny asked them not to worry and to let her check everything on her own first. On Madame Eris's face, everything that the nanny thought about the situation was evident. She informed her lordship that the young lady was perfectly fine and that they could be sure of that. The nanny assumed that the girl was just uncomfortable because the Lord was holding her too tightly. The young lady was still very small, so they needed to hold her neck properly. The man found it odd because he thought he had positioned the girl quite well. The nanny informed her lordship that they would soon have to leave, so he should take his daughter in his arms. She showed him how to hold the baby properly and warned that the signal would be in 10 minutes. The protagonist began to smile because her father was finally doing well with a slight smile. The man said that children needed much more attention than he thought. Then the servant announced the arrival of Duke Lexios Draven and today's star of the banquet princess, Alice Draven. The guests congratulated the Duke on the birth of the princess and gave him several gifts. But Alice was bored. She thought they were already close to the end based on the gifts that were left. The guests were very surprised to see the egg of a magical beast, because it was surely a high-level monster. The man congratulated the Draven family on the birth of their daughter and said he would try to surprise her. Duke. Lexios assumed that Sir Albert really had a hard time getting that egg, so the gift was special. But for Alice, who probably wouldn't make it to her 9th birthday, it was just a pretty rock. She didn't understand if there were still people in line with gifts. Suddenly, the protagonist locked eyes with a pair of gray ones. Her eyes opened wide in surprise as she realized who was right in front of her. It was the protagonist of the game called Anitio. Alice had heard that a guest from the royal family would come, but she didn't expect it to be the main character. Duke Claire had heard that the hunt was very dangerous lately, but thanks to the Draven family, the damages were minimal. The protagonist concluded that the only official ambassador of the royal family was Duke Claire. As a gift for the princess, he prepared a typical delicacy from the Duchy of Clare. Alice's father smiled enigmatically and said he had received a great gift, a superior rank die. Our protagonist looked at her father in surprise, not understanding if it was really a die. They considered it a valuable object because in the game it could only be bought with real money. If the protagonist hadn't fallen into the trap, she wouldn't have ended up in this absurd world. She looked at Initeo, who was really handsome, even for being the main character. The protagonist was in shock as she noticed the boy was looking directly at her. In a low voice, the prince murmured to himself the name of the daughter of the Draven family. But Duke Claire wished Alice the blessing of the gods and that health and wisdom would accompany her. The protagonist didn't understand what had just happened because the prince was clearly going to say something to her. She was glad they had finished. Because she was dying to go to bed, Alice stayed still when she realized she hadn't finished yet. When the servants announced the gift from the princess's father, some young men entered the hall with a covered canvas. Under a semi-transparent veil, the protagonist thought her father had prepared her portrait, or something similar. Alice wasn't sure when it had been painted, but she assumed it would be acceptable. She looked at her father and immediately became alert. Because she didn't understand what was happening, the girl truly hoped there was nothing weird on the canvas. The guests thought it was quite strange to place a flower-shaped brooch on top of the painting. Everyone present understood that the Duke valued his daughter very much. The protagonist didn't understand the reasons for that man, but she could see that he had put in a lot of effort. If that brooch was a flower from Alice, our protagonist already had one just like it, so it didn't make sense to have another. She didn't know how to react to that, so she decided to pretend she was sleepy. The Duke. Lexios examined the gift and then took the flower-shaped brooch in his hands. The protagonist was very surprised when the man pinned the brooch on her. Everyone loved seeing how he openly showed his affection for his daughter. In front of the guests, the man bent down in front of the girl and prepared to say something, but he changed his mind and stood up abruptly, leaving Alice thinking about his behavior. The Duke informed the guests that they had prepared several activities, so now they could enjoy the event. He raised his glass and exclaimed that infinite greatness would come along with Draven's future. The protagonist didn't understand, who was still making so much noise while she tried to sleep, so she closed her eyes because she realized that she had never heard that voice before. Suddenly, Alice understood that if she didn't know those people, then it wasn't clear who they were. An unknown girl said that the Duke's daughter had just opened her eyes. A boy commented that the girl did have golden eyes and that it was mesmerizing. He suggested to Prince Initeo that he should also look, because the little girl had just opened her eyes, and Initeo let out a tired sigh and asked the boys to at least lower their voices a bit. Alyssa didn't understand what was happening here because common people didn't have access to the lounge. That's why it wasn't clear how these kids whom she hadn't even seen before ended up here with the protagonist. The boy told Jennifer that the Duke was scary, but that the girl was very sweet. The girl thought that the little one was really adorable and didn't even cry even though she had already woken up. German asked if it wasn't normal for babies to cry when they were hungry or needed to go to the bathroom. Only now did the protagonist realize that the names of those kids sounded quite familiar to her. Then she remembered that they were the kids from the Heroes group, although she still didn't understand why they were here. Prince Initeo told the boys that since they had seen everything, it was time to leave. German pleaded with a sad voice for His Highness to stay a bit longer, since the guards hadn't arrived yet. But the little prince said they had already broken the rules by sneaking in here. Jennifer commented that if they had already broken the rules, it wouldn't matter if they stayed a little longer. German nodded and asked if that meant they could stay a little longer. She told His Highness that since they had already done it, they could stay a bit longer. Probably her father was too busy with alcohol to think about her, and German mentioned that his dad didn't care either, because the Duke had told him to play quietly until they left. Moreover, it was obvious that the little girl was having much more fun with them than being alone in that room. Prince Initeo was left thinking and then accepted what the kids said. German noticed how chubby Lisa's cheeks were and also felt like touching them. But Jennifer exclaimed that you couldn't touch children with dirty hands. German asked guiltily if they had already broken the rules. The prince indignantly replied that the child could get sick if they touched her with dirty hands. He asked Mr. Clare if he wanted Miss Draven to get sick. Jennifer asked His Highness to stop standing there and come closer, but the prince replied that he had to stay there because someone could suddenly appear. They were all children of noble families, and Initeo, after all, was the fourth prince. If they told the adults the truth who only wanted to see the baby, they would surely forgive them. They looked back at Alice and began to melt at how adorable she was. German asked if it would be okay if he washed his hands and then touched the baby. Alice was very sweet, and German dreamed of having a little sister like her. As soon as Alice started to smile sweetly, the kids got very excited. German reached out his hand, and Jennifer said the girl was even more adorable when she smiled. The protagonist immediately grabbed the finger of the hand German had offered her, and the kids got excited, thinking that gesture was incredibly cute. German confessed to Jennifer that his heart was racing with excitement and joy. The protagonist noticed that Jennifer's face was burning with jealousy. For that reason, she started reaching for Miss Winseker's hand. Jennifer offered her hand, even though she hadn't washed it yet. She got excited as soon as little Alice also grabbed her finger. They were all fascinated by the baby's little hands, which were also super soft. Initeo informed Mrs. Winseker and Mr. Clare that it was time to leave, since they had already spent too much time in this place, and he had already told the kids not to touch the girl with dirty hands. Jennifer suggested to His Highness that he come closer because Mrs. Draven was very nice, and he could see for himself. But the prince replied that he had already seen her when he gave her the gift, and that was enough. But Jennifer asked if Initeo hadn't gone after them because he also wanted to see the little girl. Jennifer approached the prince and asked His Highness to be honest with himself. German was very happy when he noticed that His Highness took a step toward the crib in this recap manhwa. Initeo promised that when they left, he would tell everything to the Duke and the kids' parents. The kids just smiled and told His Highness to feel free to reach out his hand. The prince asked what they were doing, but German asked him to stop pretending. Actually, Initeo also thought that little girl was very adorable. His face turned a little red when the girl also grabbed his outstretched finger. The protagonist looked at the prince directly in the eyes and smiled from ear to ear without showing much emotion. Initeo agreed with the kids that the little girl's hands were indeed very soft. Just as they said, Jennifer confessed that she didn't even want to go to the party because the trip was long. But now she didn't regret it. The protagonist was already very hungry, but she couldn't start crying. If it weren't for those kids, Alice would have done it already. But the boys might get scared. Alice decided to pretend she had fallen asleep, and this way the boys would surely leave. They noticed that the little one yawned and thought that she was already falling asleep. Suddenly, Madame Eris entered the room and asked the lady if she was still asleep. The noble family's children were scared when they realized they had been seen. The nanny entered the room and angrily asked how the gentleman and the lady had gotten to that room. The young woman approached the scared kids and looked at them sternly. Niteo calmly asked for permission to explain what had happened. There. He wanted to say what his name was, but suddenly the little one began to cry very loudly, and the kids were instantly confused. Jennifer asked if something was wrong with the girl. German commented that just a moment ago everything was fine with Elisa. Madame Eris picked up the little one in her arms and concluded that Elisa was just hungry. The nanny informed the gentleman that Princess Draven needed to eat. German wanted to say something, but Jennifer covered his mouth with her hand and announced that they were leaving. But young Mr. Clare began to resist because he wanted to play with the little one so much. As soon as the kids left, Madame Eris deduced that the young lady had older siblings. German and Jennifer bowed their heads and apologized for breaking protocol. Prince Niteo sighed tiredly and simply said he was very sorry. Duke Clare and Duke Windsor began apologizing to Alyssa's father for not watching their children. The men promised they could make a formal apology if Mr. Draven wished it. Madame Eris entered the room with Alyssa in her arms, who was smiling from ear to ear. Lexios confessed that he had mixed feelings when he heard what had happened in the room. He understood that the gentleman and his highness were still young, and that it's normal to make mistakes. But youth doesn't justify everything. Duke Clare and Duke Windsor said they completely agreed and took full responsibility. Duke Draven asked coldly what they would have done if something had happened to Alice. However, he acknowledged that Draven was partly to blame for letting the kids in. They should also take into account that the kids clearly had no bad intentions. According to Madame Eris, the ducal children and the prince were only playing with Alice. The protagonist found it funny how Niteo was trying to pretend he wasn't having fun. Lexios declared that today's incident would be considered everyone's fault, and that's how it would be resolved. That was Draven's official stance. German and Jennifer looked at each other happily, and their father valued Duke Draven's generosity. A maid entered the room and informed His Excellency that the evening event was about to begin. They headed to the patron's hall, and German was excited to see the number of stars. The protagonist was glad to see how the kids enjoyed the night. Not counting the main character, the butler exclaimed that the final event would start soon, and that the guests should look at the sky. He announced that at that moment, the Celestial Path program was starting, and that everyone should be ready. German was very surprised to see a little light flying in the sky, and couldn't stop staring at it excitedly. He asked Jennifer to look at it, but she was already looking the other way. At that moment, the little light transformed into the figure of a golden dragon in the sky, and it was something beautiful. Jennifer assumed that must be the famous golden dragon, the symbol of the Draven family. The kids got excited when they noticed that the dragon began to breathe fire and illuminated everything around. Alice looked at her father, who used to always look at her with a cold and penetrating gaze. But now, Lexios had a completely different look, and that was what surprised her the most. In that gaze, the protagonist felt the love of a man that warmed her soul. But Alicia quickly pushed those thoughts away, thinking it was just because it was very late. The nanny asked the little one to look at the sky, and as soon as the protagonist did, she was fascinated. The flying little light took the shape of Alicia herself, just like in that portrait, and it was something magical and amazing. The guests commented that the Duke's love must be much deeper, because even the princess's first birthday wasn't celebrated this grandly. The protagonist had never imagined that someone would do something so special and surprising for her. Lexios's gaze changed as soon as the nanny assumed that the young lady was very happy. At that moment, Madame Eris asked the little one not to let go of her arms, because it was very dangerous for her. But Duke Draven asked the nanny to hand Alicia over, and the young woman accepted without hesitation. She passed the girl to the Duke, and he took her in his arms, with great care, tenderness, and affection. German was excited to see that Alicia in the sky began to move and shine, more than all the stars. Lexios said that the magic didn't even come close to showing its true beauty. The tone and reaction of the Duke made Alice laugh, and she began to smile from ear to ear. But in reality, looking at her father, the protagonist felt strange learning about her fate and that of her family. Alicia only thought about how to escape. She was sure she would reject her father, but he kept trying to get close to her over and over again. Lexios seemed to silently apologize to his daughter, confessing how much he loved her. He promised that from that moment on, he would be a good father to little Alicia. She kept reminding herself that this man wanted to name her after a snake and kill her on her 9th birthday. The protagonist kept repeating that she didn't want him, and that she just wanted to flee from her fate, staying away from him. Suddenly, a slight smile appeared on Duke Draven's face, and he thanked Alicia. The protagonist felt sad because she was truly trying to keep her distance, and started covering herself with her hands. But the Duke thought that his daughter found it uncomfortable again. But then, the protagonist smiled, because she had a hope that a miracle would happen that would allow her to stay with her father. Duke Clare and Duke Windsor thanked Duke Draven for allowing their children to play with the young lady. Jennifer angrily stated that German couldn't call the little girl by her name without permission. The girl didn't understand how the little one could have such soft cheeks. Agnes, a bit embarrassed, said that the young lady was so adorable that just looking at her made her happy. The protagonist thought to herself how Agnes could act like that in front of the kids if even the main character was in shock. The maid took the little one in her arms and suggested to the young lady to go to her room. Agnes lifted the protagonist, and at that moment Alice noticed the prince. The protagonist wondered what he was thinking when he looked at her like that. The real protagonist wouldn't even look at someone he didn't care about. With his innate talent, he almost never showed emotions. Half asleep, Alice remembered that Aniteo's abilities were related to clairvoyance. The butler announced that the next carriage could move forward. Duke Winsaker congratulated Duke Draven again on the birth of the young lady. Herman threw himself on the ground and started screaming that he wanted to stay there and live with Alice. Everyone but Duke Draven watched the child's tantrum with a smile. Duke Claire promised his son that they would visit the young lady again. They sealed the promise with their pinkies so that German would really believe it. The young son of Duke Claire waved goodbye to Alice with his hand and promised that he would come back to visit her. But Lexios asked irritably who had told that girl she could come back. Only when she wanted to, he ordered that from today, no visits from the Duke Claire's family be allowed. The protagonist noticed that the servants had taken all the gifts to the lounge. Then the young lady saw the portrait of her father that was also in that room. Agnes sincerely replied that he couldn't compare to Alice's cuteness, but that gift was still nice. The protagonist smiled because the gift really wasn't bad at all. Time passed, the seasons changed, and our heroine's body grew little by little. The maid brought her a spoonful of porridge and making airplane sounds, asked the young lady to eat it. As her body grew, the protagonist went through different stages of development. The girl sat up without support, stood up holding onto one hand, and walked holding onto the furniture, and today the protagonist was trying to walk by herself. Madame Erie commented that the little one was walking much better than expected. The carpet was so soft that the protagonist found it difficult to walk on it. Agnes thought her lady was amazing and was sure she would start talking soon. Alice was happy that the days of incomprehensible babbling were finally coming to an end. Until now, she had only accelerated her development a bit, and luckily no one had found it strange. Maybe because being Draven, they simply didn't find it odd that she grew so fast. At this rate, Alice could start saying simple words by her first birthday. If you think about it, the Draven are known for inheriting talents from the dragon lineage. The protagonist thought that maybe she could also inherit some talent, like her father's swordsmanship, or perhaps Alicia could gain special magical abilities, or extraordinary intelligence. But considering how the protagonist ended up in this body, better not talk about genius. At first, Alicia only thought about how to survive, but now everything has changed. The nanny stood up and bowed her head as soon as she saw the gentleman entering the room. Duke Draven came every day just to see his daughter. Madame Eris informed the gentleman that nothing had happened to Alicia in his absence. Lexios got excited as soon as the nanny told him that morning Alicia had taken 10 steps. The girl almost fell a couple of times, but she quickly regained her balance and kept going. The Duke extended his arms toward his daughter and said that it needed to be recorded. Alicia earned a prize for taking 10 steps without falling once. Then the protagonist noticed how her father's hand went into his pocket. Lexios handed over another flower-shaped brooch as a gift for his daughter. Agnes exclaimed with enthusiasm that this time the brooch was especially beautiful due to its slight reddish hue inside. It looked like a ruby crafted with the breath of a scarlet flame, but due to the detailed design, the petals were sharper, and Alicia could only wear it when she turned 8. Duke Draven nodded completely, in agreement with the maid's words. He asked Alicia if she would let Daddy see her achievements. The protagonist took a few steps, and the Duke immediately praised his daughter. Lexios asked if she wanted to play with Daddy now, and she nodded right away. He asked her what she would like to play with Daddy or what she would like to do together. The man did everything possible for his daughter to call him Daddy, and that made the protagonist laugh a lot. Alicia decided not to bother the man anymore and called him Daddy, which made him very happy. As the little one managed to do it, she would receive another gift and would be delighted. It was a brooch without precious stones, but made from the feather of a flying red beast. Agnes noticed that Alicia started yawning and suggested to the young lady that it was time to go to bed. At that moment, the protagonist felt incredibly happy and full of hope. Alicia truly wished that this happiness lasted as long as possible, so she wouldn't have to part with it in the middle of the night. The girl felt a gentle breeze that moved her hair. The protagonist frowned upon hearing voices and thought they really opened the window. The unknown voices seemed to want to do something, while no one was watching, and that made her uneasy. At that instant, Alicia opened her eyes wide to see where the sound was coming from and understand what was happening. But to her surprise, the protagonist discovered that there was absolutely no one in the room. Alicia wondered what exactly she had just heard, and who could be nearby. The window was tightly shut, and then the protagonist extended her hand upon noticing a strange glow. At that same moment, a mysterious light began to concentrate around her hand and caught her attention. Alicia looked around, convinced that she still hadn't fully woken up. To the protagonist, it was clear that something touched her hand, and it was a strangely pleasant sensation. Alicia was very scared as soon as that strange light appeared again. She felt afraid because the girl really started to think that there was a ghost. In the room, she began to scream, causing Agnes to get up from the bed. Lately, the young lady had been getting very close to the gentleman, which made the maids wonder why Agnes had been sad these days, because they started to think that she had simply bored the young lady. The maid suggested to Alice to change her clothes, and the girl immediately started to smile. The protagonist was very happy. As soon as they went out for a walk in the garden, Duke Draven was pushing the stroller and couldn't stop smiling at the sight of his daughter's smile. He suggested to Alice to show her the autumn leaves and lifted her in his arms. Then Lexios lifted her toward the sky, and the protagonist started laughing heartily. But Alice suddenly fell silent and got very scared as soon as she heard that strange voice again. Duke Draven looked at his daughter in surprise as soon as he realized she had gone quiet. The strange voices kept saying that it wasn't the time yet and that they had to wait a bit longer. Alice began to tremble with fear, and the adults tried to calm her, thinking she had gotten scared because of the height. The protagonist felt scared because even being with her dad, she kept hearing ghosts. The maid showed the little one a toy, but she didn't react, so the man was left pensive. He snapped his fingers and immediately fire appeared in his hand, which left Alice very surprised. Then the Duke lifted his hand toward him and said that he hadn't used magic in a long time. Alice was surprised that her dad could also use magic and got excited because it was the first time she saw magic so closely. A big smile appeared on the girl's face, and the little one tried to touch the fire. The Duke reassured the worried nanny, saying that this flame didn't give off heat. The protagonist thought it was incredible to see a fire that didn't burn and wanted to touch it. Lexios warned his daughter that fire is dangerous and that it shouldn't be touched just like that. The protagonist looked at her father with hope and called him Daddy. The man said that Daddy's fire is special, so everything should be fine. Alicia reached out her hand toward the flame, and suddenly it began to grow at full speed. The Duke raised his hand and waved it, trying to extinguish the fire. Agnes, nervous, immediately ran toward the man and took Alicia out of his arms. But the flames wouldn't stop and quickly lunged toward the protagonist. Unknown voices began to say that this was not good at all, frightening Alicia even more. Around her, glowing orbs appeared, and a voice spoke with an unexpected resonance. The protagonist began to wave her arms and scream something incomprehensible about a ghost. The man became alert as soon as his daughter screamed the word Daddy. Duke Draven raised his arm and struck the ground with all his might. The orbs flew off in different directions, and a strange voice said that this was even funny. The protagonist pointed at the orbs with her finger, and terrified began to scream that there were ghosts there. The man didn't understand what was happening, and asked Alicia to tell him everything. The protagonist kept looking at the orbs, and shouting to her dad that there was a ghost there. Only then did Alicia realize that the man didn't understand anything because of her childish way of speaking, so the girl with her hand trembling pointed at one of the orbs, and clearly told her dad that there was a ghost there. The Duke raised his head and, confused, asked if it was really a spirit. The protagonist was lying in her crib when an unknown voice asked her if she was okay after the spirit incident. Duke Draven was always lost in thought, according to his father. The protagonist mistook the spirit for a ghost. Normally, wind spirits stay in their own realm and almost never come to the human world. But sometimes there are reasons for them to appear. The first reason is that they are forced to join a person, and the second is that they are drawn by high compatibility, also called affinity. The protagonist didn't understand at all why they were always around her in this recap manhwa. The Duke concluded that the magical flame also grew because of the spirit. That was odd because normal spirits fear dragon energy, so in their family there was almost never affinity with spirits. Alice remembered that even in the original story, it was rare to find people who had spirits. The protagonist felt relieved as soon as she understood that it wasn't a ghost. As soon as Lexios realized that Alice had summoned a spirit again, he called it incredible. However, Alice was still too young for a spirit, and the protagonist completely agreed. The Duke began to worry because the girl was afraid of those creatures. He gently stroked Alice's head and asked her not to worry because Daddy was with her. The protagonist felt how the tension began to fade away, and little by little she fell asleep. The wind spirit wizard named Cephal confirmed the Duke Draven's suspicion because the girl did have a bond. Moreover, the young lady had a great affinity with wind spirits. They still needed to investigate more to be sure, but in the future, the little one might surpass even him. The wind spirit wizard warned that for now the young lady was too young for that. That power is too heavy a burden for a girl, and normally spirits almost never show interest in small children. Cephal warned that if the young lady kept being afraid of spirits, her development could be hindered. Lexios admitted that it was the first time he saw Alice so scared. The wind spirit wizard asked the Duke if in that case they could use the method he had talked about before. This method was called sealing, and there was no risk for the child. Once sealed, removing it wasn't something that could be done immediately. But since the young lady was still under a year old, it was the best time. Alicia's face filled with worry, because she didn't understand what they meant by sealing the spirit. She was scared because she thought they were ghosts. But now everything was okay. How could they be so sure there wouldn't be side effects? And besides, when would the seal be removed? In reality, the protagonist was very eager to contradict them. Alice noticed that the spirits started to swirl around Eret Seaful and were restlessly repeating the word seal. The wind spirit wizard asked the mischievous spirits not to get angry, because they were not going to seal them. The old man explained that he wanted to temporarily seal the young lady's bond with the spirits. Eret Seaful asked the spirits if they had at least heard how scared the young lady was. Instead of complaining about how unfair everything was, the spirits should first apologize to Alice. The ones who broke the rules were the spirits, and now the innocent young lady would have to bear the seal. The wind spirit wizard, with a calm voice, announced that they would perform the ritual tomorrow. After that, the old man began to scold the spirits, asking what they could say to a girl who wasn't even a year old. Eret Seaful waved his hand and told the spirits to leave quickly. He said they needed to do the ritual as soon as possible, because the spirits were too insistent. The old man asked them not to worry, because once he hunted high-ranking magical creatures, alongside the previous Duke Draven. Eret Seaful bowed and announced that he would prepare for the ritual then. The protagonist looked confused at the wind spirit wizard as soon as he winked at her. Alice thought he wasn't a bad person, although he was clearly hiding something. Lexios asked his daughter what she was thinking so seriously. He told Alice not to be afraid, because Grandpa would help her stop seeing those beings. The Duke also felt a bit scared. But as a medium meister, Seaful was trustworthy. The protagonist wanted to tell her dad that she was okay. Lexios sighed tiredly and confessed that sometimes he felt that Alice understood everything he said. The man felt a bit sad that the girl couldn't talk yet, but in reality, the protagonist understood everything and could speak. However, the little one couldn't let anyone know. Agnes informed Alice that that night she would sleep by her side, so she didn't have to worry. The deep night arrived, and the two of them were already peacefully sleeping in their beds. The protagonist felt the wind again and thought that Agnes hadn't closed the window. She opened her eyes wide as soon as she realized who could have left the window open in the middle of a winter. As she suspected it was the spirits, that Alice believed the wizard had already dismissed. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed that the cards began to fly, which was a bit scary. The cards began to form words, and in the end, Alice saw a message apologizing for the previous teasing. The protagonist was a bit surprised to realize that the spirits had come to apologize. Alice was stunned to remember that children her age didn't know how to read. Distrustfully, she asked if the spirit knew that she could speak. Upon receiving a positive response, the protagonist realized that this was a real problem. The spirits promised they wouldn't reveal that secret, and Alice wondered why there was less spiritual energy than usual. The girl thought that maybe she had just gotten too scared because in reality the spirits weren't bad. A big smile appeared on the protagonist's face as soon as she touched the spirit, taking a deep breath. The little girl told the being that she forgave it. She was a bit surprised when the spirit suddenly let go and flew up. Broke free and flew up. The creature thanked Alice and asked her not to seal it. The protagonist let out a weary sigh and promised she would think about it. The spirit got closer to Alice's face and she smiled instantly, comparing the being to a pet. She yawned and told it she was going to sleep, so she wished the spirit good night. The butlers knew perfectly well that they had little time and needed to hurry. The spirit wizard of the wind reminded Mr. Draven that there was nothing to worry about. The elder was sure everything would turn out fine and that there was no reason to doubt. Eret Seaful asked Alice's personal maid if they had prepared the young lady. The Duke asked suspiciously why there was so much interest, and the maid replied that with age come wrinkles and the urge to gossip. Eret Seaful looked at the portrait of Alice and added that they were almost ready. Lexios asked if they really only needed an empty room. The mage said he had everything ready for the ritual, and asked how the Duke planned to calm the young lady. The protagonist didn't understand at all why that worried the mage so much. The father approached his daughter and asked Alice if she had slept well. The little girl immediately opened her arms and with a big smile called for her dad. Lexio immediately felt his heart pounding from what his daughter did, like how Alice greeted him so sweetly. The Duke promised he would give her a gift. The maid, somewhat nervous, asked if the discarded ritual was really safe for the girl. The Duke assured the young lady in a serious tone that everything would be fine. A tear rolled down Agnes's cheek, and she asked why the spirits had taken an interest in her young lady. The protagonist touched the maid's face, trying to calm her. The spirit mage of the wind announced that they could now start the ritual. Eret Seaful approached and asked if the young lady was ready. The elder looked at the protagonist, who was watching him with disgust. The wind spirit mage announced to everyone that the spirits were already present. As everything was ready, Eret Seaful asked them to bring the young lady closer, but the protagonist slapped the mage's hand and exclaimed that she wouldn't do it. She looked at the elder sternly and repeated her words. Arithsifal reminded the gentleman that the discarded ritual was the best way to keep the spirits away from the girl, even if they managed to scare away the spirits that were bothering Lisa. As long as the bond wasn't suppressed, others would keep coming. When that happened, the young lady would suffer and cry again. If only Alice had spoken up earlier, her father wouldn't have had to worry so much, but the protagonist couldn't reveal her secret because then people would discover that she wasn't the real Alice. Still, the little girl was sure that she and her dad were thinking exactly the same thing. At that moment, the wind spirit mage was very surprised when Duke Draven called him uncle. Arid, Alice's father, said they were going to act like nothing had happened. The protagonist looked at her father in amazement because she didn't expect him to say that in this recap manhwa. The Duke promised the mage that he would pay him double what they had agreed since Arithsifal had traveled so much he could stay and rest a little longer in the duchy. However, he declared firmly that they weren't going to do the discarded ritual. The protagonist hugged her father tighter, thinking he was the best in the world. The wind spirit mage coldly asked His Excellency why he had made that decision. After all, it was the Duke who sent the letter asking for help, and now suddenly he was backing out. If a sick child doesn't like something, that doesn't mean the father should stop treating them. Arithsifal was sure that the young lady still couldn't make mature decisions like an adult. Before it was too late, the wind mage asked the Duke to trust the young lady. The elder didn't understand if His Excellency really thought of leaving the young lady among those rude spirits. He was convinced that in some way that could even be considered violence. One of the spirits approached the protagonist and asked her to stop the seal. Alice understood perfectly that not even the spirits wanted the seal to be made. The protagonist reached out to the spirit and the Duke lit a flame on his finger. The spirit took the form of a girl and asked the child if she wasn't afraid of the fire, and requested her to tell the Duke to put it out. Alice smiled and told the being that everything was fine and that she didn't need to worry. The fairy asked the girl not to accept the ritual because she shouldn't do it just for them. The spirit promised the girl that they wouldn't follow her, but asked her not to seal them. The girl started to cry and begged Alice not to seal herself. For them. The status window warned that a new event had activated, and the protagonist felt that her body, once again, wasn't responding. It was the same type of message she received when her name was called and she leveled up. The player's actions marked the character's future, so Alice could only say one thing. The protagonist smiled from ear to ear and told the being that they were friends now. She reminded the spirit that she had already talked about forgiveness yesterday, so now she wouldn't be scared even if he spoke to her. Alice extended her hand and repeated that they were friends now. The spirit smiled and told the young lady that she accepted to be her friend. The being kissed the girl on the cheek and thanked her. Then the protagonist exclaimed that she wouldn't do it at that very moment. The wind mage started laughing loudly, leaving everyone surprised. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening, or why the mage was acting so weird. Alice was left speechless when Arithsifal suddenly pushed the spirit away with little effort. She frowned, wondering if the mage really thought he could do that. The protagonist got scared when the elder suddenly placed his hand on her head. Arithsifal admitted that the young lady was really impressive. The spirit approached the girl and Alice asked if she was okay, immediately receiving an affirmative response. The Duke sighed deeply and confessed that he didn't know whether to scold his daughter or admire her. He concluded that lately Alice was full of surprises. Lexios asked the maid Agnes to call the servants, to return everything to the room. Duke Draven told Arithsifal that this time he had gone too far, but the wind spirit mage replied that to deceive the enemy army, one must first deceive one's own. Since they were already done, the mage proposed to the young ones to have a cup of tea. The protagonist realized that they had indeed tricked her and didn't understand when all this started. Alice was sitting at the table trying to understand what all of this meant. The mage tasted the tea and immediately got excited because it was made with leaves aged 15 years. The Duke replied that it was a small detail compared to what Arithsifal had done for them. He asked the mage to explain everything again about the ritual, because Alice probably didn't fully understand it either. So she also needed an explanation. Arithsifal commented that His Excellency had changed a lot lately. The mage remembered how 4 years ago Lexios said he didn't plan to have kids. The first thing Arithsifal did was talk about the contract, and the age recalling that he had already said that spirits rarely come to small children. In short, making a contract with a spirit is communicating with it and borrowing its power. That's why the owner of the spirit must have exceptional will, intelligence, and self-control. Thanks to their bond, they shared magical energy between them. Normally, it's said that spirits come to children of 7 years, but in reality, it's not that simple. Duke Draven asked the wind spirit mage what he meant. Now, the issue wasn't the age itself, but the control that had developed. By that moment, so a child who attracts spirits already has a hidden ability to control them. That's why when Arithsifal received the letter, he already had certain suspicions. The wind spirit mage thought that the young lady was incredibly smart and talented. But in the letter, there were also unclear things that His Excellency talked about. First, the young lady was afraid of spirits, And second, she didn't differ much from other kids her age. Arithsifol said he read the letter carefully, along with all the praises toward the daughter. But in general, Alice was just smarter than the others, nothing more. To dominate spirits, one needs a control that intelligence alone isn't enough for, considering the peculiarities of the Draven family. Arithsifol became even more interested and decided to see it all for himself. It was then that the Wind Mage understood that his first assumption was totally correct. The young lady was just scared by his sudden appearance. So neither of the spirits expected that reaction. But being a girl from the Draven family and chosen by the spirits, Alice didn't stand out too much. That's why Arithsifol mentioned the unsealed ritual on purpose, because often hidden potential comes to light in extreme situations. The Duke asked what would happen if things didn't go as they expected, and Alice rejected the ritual. Arithsifol, smiling, said that in that case he would simply perform the ritual anyway. Alice's father sighed tiredly and told him that the mage was still the same, and Arithsifol noticed that the Duke had indeed changed. Nevertheless, nothing serious would happen because the seal would only break in 5 years. The Duke said that, right? There was the biggest problem with Aritsifol's method. Suddenly the mage said there was something else that caught his attention, since they were preparing the ritual that was quite important. He talked about the brooch that Duke Draven gave to the young lady, and that surprised her because of its shine. It seemed to be made of gems from the Alverta lands famous for their beauty. The way it was set was quite unusual and didn't seem like the work of a human craftsman capable of making something like that. The Duke nodded and commented that the wind spirit mage had particularly sharp eyesight, which caught his attention. Arithsifol with shining eyes asked who had made it. After a while, the wind spirit mage got into the carriage and announced that due to the large amount of work he had to leave. Before leaving, he told the young lady that it's okay to befriend spirits, but that it would be better to make the contract a little later. Alice asked why, and Arithsifol explained to her that her body was simply too fragile. Duke Draven told his little girl that they would think about the contract later. The protagonist was glad that the problem had been resolved and wondered if she could now speak well. But as it turned out, the girl's fears were unfounded. The adults considered the young lady the most outstanding person in the world, so Alice had nothing to worry about anymore. Now the protagonist could talk, and she had also made good friends, so everything was going great. Agnes put Alice to bed and told her that she had the gift of foresight. The maid told her that a few days earlier, she had dreamed that the young lady was talking to someone. She couldn't hear the other voice, but the girl said goodbye very sweetly and wished her good night. Which is why Agnes was very surprised when the young lady spoke during the day, because it sounded just like in her dream. The protagonist closed her eyes and told her maid that she wanted to sleep now in this recap manhwa. Agnes immediately turned off the light and wished Alice good night. Our protagonist smiled, somewhat confused, and understood that next time she would have to be much more careful.